I was folding tiny onesies in our bedroom when I found the note tucked between the bills on Edward's nightstand. My hands were still slightly swollen from the pregnancy, making my wedding ring tight as I unfolded the paper with his familiar handwriting. The words hit me like a physical blow. Either get rid of it, or I'm gone. Your choice, Stella. You have until Friday. It was Tuesday evening. I was 7 months pregnant with our first child, a baby we'd supposedly planned together, discussed names for, set up a nursery for. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was surrounded by the evidence of our shared future while holding proof that he wanted to destroy it. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the edge of our bed, still clutching the ultrasound photos I'd been planning to frame. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, as if sensing my distress. I pressed my hand to my belly, feeling the solid reality of the life growing inside me, the life my husband of 3 years was now demanding I eliminate. The note was dated 2 days ago, which meant he'd been watching me prepare for our child while secretly planning this ultimatum. I'd been folding baby clothes and researching cribs while he'd been calculating how to force me into the most devastating choice a woman could face. My name is Stella Elizabeth Morrison, and 3 days ago, I was a 31-year-old marketing director who thought she had a solid marriage and a bright future. I'd built my career from nothing, working nights to put myself through business school, earning respect in a competitive industry through sheer determination and strategic thinking. Those same skills that made me successful in boardrooms would soon become essential for survival in my own home. Edward had been my college sweetheart, the charming psychology major who said he wanted a family someday. We'd married right after graduation, spent 3 years building what I thought was a partnership. I'd supported his graduate studies, covered more than my share of expenses while he established his practice, and believed his promises about wanting children when the time was right. Apparently, 7 months into our planned pregnancy, he decided the time would never be right. The note's casual cruelty revealed everything about how little my feelings mattered to him. He hadn't even bothered to have this conversation face to face. Instead, he'd left instructions like I was an employee he was terminating, not his wife carrying his child. The clinical detachment in his handwriting suggested this wasn't an emotional outburst, it was a calculated decision he'd been considering for months. I heard his car in the driveway and quickly refolded the note, placing it exactly where I'd found it. When he walked through the bedroom door 15 minutes later, acting like nothing had changed, I understood I was looking at a stranger. This man who kissed my forehead and asked about my day had given me a 3-day deadline to choose between my marriage and my child's life, then pretended everything was normal. "How was your appointment today?" he asked, loosening his tie. The routine question felt obscene now that I knew he was hoping the answer might solve his problem for him. "Everything's perfect," I told him, watching his face carefully. "The baby's measuring right on schedule." Something flickered in his expression, disappointment, maybe, or frustration that nature hadn't handled his dilemma for him. In that moment, I realized this wasn't sudden panic about fatherhood. This was something much colder, much more calculated, and much more dangerous than I'd initially understood. Truth is, I wasn't completely surprised. The signs had been building for months, subtle shifts I'd explained away because I wanted to believe in the man I'd married. It started around my 20th week, when the pregnancy became visibly obvious. Edward began working late more frequently, citing new patient loads and administrative responsibilities. His phone, which used to sit openly on counters, was suddenly password protected and constantly with him. The affection changed too. He stopped touching my belly when we talked about the baby, stopped participating in conversations about names and nursery themes. When friends asked about his excitement, he'd give vague responses about big changes ahead rather than expressing joy about becoming a father. I'd attributed it to normal pre-baby anxiety, the same nerves I was feeling about our changing dynamic. His questions became strange and pointed. He'd ask about my work benefits, specifically my life insurance policy and maternity leave provisions. He wanted to know details about my savings accounts, investments I'd built independently during our marriage. When I mentioned updating our wills to include the baby, he insisted we wait until after the birth, claiming it was premature to make legal changes. The biggest red flag came during my 24th week appointment. Edward had attended every previous visit, asking detailed questions and recording the heartbeat on his phone. That day, he sat silent in the corner, checking his watch and seeming almost irritated by the baby's healthy progress. When the doctor mentioned that viability outside the womb was now possible, Edward's reaction wasn't relief. It was something that looked distinctly like disappointment. Friends started commenting on his behavior at social gatherings. He disappeared during conversations about baby preparations, finding excuses to step outside or check his phone. When my sister organized a baby shower, he discouraged me from having it, saying it was too much fuss for something that should be private family time. Looking back, I think he was already planning how to minimize the social connections that would make his ultimatum more complicated. The phone calls were another warning sign. Edward would take calls in his car or step outside, claiming patient confidentiality issues. But psychology practice calls don't typically come at 10 p.m. on weekends or during family dinners. When I mentioned the frequency of evening calls, he became defensive, accusing me of being paranoid and overly emotional due to pregnancy hormones. His attitude toward our shared future began changing in subtle but unmistakable ways. He stopped contributing to conversations about childcare arrangements, school districts, or long-term financial planning. When I suggested we start looking at larger apartments, he said we should wait and see how things develop. Most tellingly, he began talking about his practice in terms of individual goals rather than family objectives, mentioning opportunities that would require significant travel or relocation. So I made some quiet moves of my own. The marketing skills that had built my career included reading people, anticipating problems, and preparing strategic responses. If my husband was planning something that involved our financial future and my insurance policies, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I opened a separate savings account, transferring small amounts that wouldn't show up obviously on our joint statements. I made copies of all our important documents, insurance policies, bank records, property deeds, and stored them in a safe deposit box he didn't know about. When I updated my emergency contacts at work, I removed Edward as the primary contact and listed my sister instead. Most importantly, I started documenting everything. I kept detailed records of his behavior changes, photographed the note on his nightstand, and began recording our conversations when discussing the baby or our future. I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, but instinct told me I needed evidence of something. I also quietly researched Edward's professional background more thoroughly than I ever had during our relationship. It's embarrassing to admit, but I'd trusted him completely and never verified basic facts about his practice, his credentials, or his professional standing. What I discovered in public records and professional databases raised questions I should have asked years earlier. The night I found the ultimatum, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in our kitchen with my laptop, methodically investigating the man I'd married and the life we'd built together. By morning, I understood that Edward's demand wasn't just about the baby, it was about removing an obstacle to plans he'd been making without my knowledge. I waited until Edward left for work, then called in sick and drove to my sister's house. Emma took one look at my face and knew something catastrophic had happened. When I showed her the note, her reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "We're calling a lawyer. Right now. Today." Emma worked as a paralegal for a family law firm and had seen enough divorce cases to recognize the warning signs I'd been missing. She made the call while I sat numbly on her couch, still processing the complete upheaval of everything I thought I knew about my life. Margaret Barrett, the attorney Emma recommended, could see me that afternoon. Her office was in a downtown high-rise, all polished wood and professional confidence. When I handed her Edward's note and explained the context, her expression grew increasingly grave. "Stella, this isn't just about your pregnancy," she said after reviewing the timeline I'd prepared. "This is economic coercion with potentially criminal implications. A man who would demand his 7 months pregnant wife terminate her pregnancy under threat of abandonment is capable of much worse." She asked detailed questions about our financial arrangements, my insurance policies, and Edward's recent behavior. When I mentioned his questions about my benefits and his reluctance to update our wills, she leaned forward with obvious concern. I need you to listen very carefully, Margaret said. Based on what you're describing, there's a possibility your husband sees your pregnancy, and potentially you, as obstacles to some kind of financial gain. The timing of this ultimatum, combined with his interest in your insurance and assets, suggests planning that goes beyond wanting to avoid fatherhood. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Margaret was suggesting that my husband might be planning something that involved my death or disappearance, that the baby wasn't the only thing he wanted eliminated from his life. What do I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. First, you don't go home alone. Ever. Second, we document everything and build a case that protects both you and your child. Third, we get law enforcement involved, because if I'm right about his intentions, you're in danger that goes far beyond a divorce. Margaret introduced me to Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who specialized in domestic crimes and financial fraud. The three of us met the following morning in Margaret's conference room, where I laid out everything I documented about Edward's behavior and recent changes. Detective Rodriguez asked questions that revealed investigative thinking I hadn't considered. Had Edward increased my life insurance recently? Were there any changes to beneficiaries on our accounts? Had he shown unusual interest in my work schedule or daily routines? The answers painted a picture that terrified me. Mrs. Morrison, Detective Rodriguez said, we're going to investigate your husband thoroughly. Based on what you've described, there are several criminal statutes that might apply here: coercion, fraud, and potentially conspiracy. I need you to understand that if our suspicions are correct, your pregnancy isn't the problem. You are. The investigation moved quickly once law enforcement became involved. Detective Rodriguez coordinated with financial crime specialists to examine Edward's business accounts, professional communications, and recent financial activity. What they found exceeded even Margaret's worst-case scenario concerns. Edward had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me 6 months earlier, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. He'd done this without my knowledge, using forged signatures on documents I'd never seen. The policy was worth nearly $2 million, far exceeding anything justified by our modest lifestyle or shared debts. More damaging was the evidence found in his professional communications. Edward had been corresponding with someone about resolving the pregnancy situation and eliminating complications to future plans. The language was coded, but clearly referenced both me and the baby as problems requiring permanent solutions. The financial investigation revealed that Edward had been systematically positioning himself to benefit from my death. He'd researched how life insurance payouts work for pregnant women, specifically asking about policies that cover both mother and unborn child. He'd also made inquiries about my employee benefits, particularly death benefits and succession planning for my position at work. Most disturbing was evidence that this wasn't his first time. Detective Rodriguez discovered that Edward had been married twice before, marriages that had ended in the sudden deaths of both wives under suspicious circumstances. Neither case had been investigated thoroughly at the time, but patterns emerged when viewed alongside his current behavior. Your husband is what we call a Black Widow killer, Detective Rodriguez explained during one of our meetings. He marries women with financial assets, isolates them from support systems, then eliminates them when they're most vulnerable. Your pregnancy makes you an ideal target because it provides a cover story for medical complications. The scope of Edward's planning was breathtaking in its cold calculation. He'd researched pregnancy complications that could be induced artificially, investigated untraceable methods of causing premature labor or maternal death, and prepared explanations that would position him as a grieving widower rather than a murder suspect. The case expanded beyond my individual situation when Detective Rodriguez connected with investigators from Edward's previous locations. A pattern emerged of women who died under suspicious circumstances, all of whom had been involved with Edward at the time of their deaths. The investigation now involved multiple jurisdictions and federal oversight due to the interstate nature of his apparent crimes. My role shifted from victim to key witness in a complex criminal case. I worked with investigators to gather real-time evidence of Edward's intentions, wearing recording devices during our conversations and documenting his continued pressure about the pregnancy. The The surveillance revealed the extent of his planning, including surveillance equipment he'd installed in our home and tracking devices on my car. The breakthrough came when investigators intercepted Edward's communications with an accomplice, someone he'd hired to stage an accident that would kill both me and the baby while making his death appear natural. The recordings provided clear evidence of premeditated murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud. Federal authorities moved to arrest Edward and his accomplice simultaneously. The FBI coordinated with local police to ensure both men were taken into custody before they could execute their plan. The timing was critical. Investigators believed Edward was planning to act within days of his Friday ultimatum deadline. I wasn't present for Edward's arrest, but Detective Rodriguez called me immediately afterward to confirm that both men were in custody and that I was safe. The relief was overwhelming, followed quickly by the realization that I'd been living with a man who was actively planning to murder me and our unborn child. The evidence against Edward was overwhelming. In addition to the insurance fraud and murder conspiracy charges, investigators found proof of his involvement in the deaths of his previous wives. The case became a multi-state prosecution that revealed the extent of his criminal pattern and the sophistication of his methods. The trial was extensive and deeply publicized. Edward's defense team attempted to portray his ultimatum as relationship conflict rather than criminal coercion, but the evidence of his broader planning and historical pattern made their arguments untenable. The recordings of his conversations with the hired accomplice provided undeniable proof of his intentions. I testified about the note, the behavior changes, and the systematic way he'd tried to isolate me and gain control of my assets. The prosecution presented evidence of the life insurance fraud, the surveillance equipment, and the detailed plans for staging my death. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Edward received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. His accomplice received a 25-year sentence in exchange for cooperation. The other jurisdictions where Edward's previous wives had died reopened their investigations, leading to additional charges and providing closure for families who'd never understood what really happened to their loved ones. The resolution brought justice not just for me, but for women whose deaths had been dismissed as accidents or medical complications. The case led to changes in how law enforcement investigates suspicious deaths of pregnant women and established protocols for recognizing patterns of domestic financial abuse. My daughter, I named her Hope, was born healthy 2 months after Edward's arrest. She'll never know the man who tried to prevent her existence, but she'll grow up understanding that sometimes the right choice requires tremendous courage and that seeking help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The life insurance money Edward had taken out on me was returned, and the court ordered restitution for the fraud he'd committed. More importantly, the investigation revealed assets Edward had hidden from previous crimes, providing some compensation for the families of his other victims. I kept my job throughout the ordeal, with my company providing incredible support during the investigation and trial. My colleagues had noticed Edward's strange behavior at company events, but hadn't known how to interpret it. Several mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him without being able to explain why, confirmation that trusting instincts about people is usually the right choice. The experience taught me that evil can wear familiar faces and speak loving words while planning unthinkable acts. Edward had been a respected psychologist, a charming husband, and a seemingly devoted partner who was simultaneously a calculating killer. The cognitive dissonance of discovering such a complete deception was almost as traumatic as the physical danger I'd faced. But it also taught me about the power of preparation, documentation, and seeking help when something feels wrong. The marketing skills that helped me succeed professionally, reading people, anticipating problems, building strategic alliances, quite literally saved my life. If I hadn't trusted my instincts and taken those quiet preparatory steps, neither Hope nor I would have survived Edward's plan. The case prompted legislative changes in several states regarding life insurance fraud and domestic violence prosecution. My testimony before state legislative committees helped establish new protocols for investigating suspicious insurance applications and recognizing patterns of financial abuse. These changes will hopefully prevent other women from facing the choice Edward tried to force on me. Hope is now 6 months old, a thriving baby who fills our apartment with laughter and possibility. We live in a different city, in a home where every lock was chosen by me and every window has an escape route. I've learned to trust carefully and verify completely, but I haven't lost my capacity for joy or optimism about the future. The other victims' families and I maintain contact, supporting each other through the ongoing legal processes and sharing the strange bond of having survived Edward's manipulations. We've become advocates for women in similar situations, working with law enforcement and victim services to improve recognition and response to domestic financial crimes. When people ask how I knew to document everything and seek help so quickly, I tell them about the gift of fear, that uncomfortable feeling that tells you something isn't right, even when you can't identify what's wrong. Edward's ultimatum wasn't the beginning of his threat, it was just the moment his intentions became impossible to ignore. I made my choice that Tuesday evening when I found his note. I chose my daughter, my safety, and my future over a man who saw us as obstacles to his personal enrichment. It was the right choice then, and it's the right choice now. Hope and I are building a life based on authentic love, genuine security, and the knowledge that we survived something meant to destroy us. The experience changed everything about how I approach relationships and trust, but it didn't break my faith in the possibility of genuine partnership. Someday, when Hope is older and I've continued healing, there might be room in our lives for someone who sees a family as a blessing rather than a burden. But for now, we're complete just as we are, two survivors who chose life over convenience, truth over comfortable lies, and courage over compliance with someone else's dangerous demands. Edward wanted me to choose between him and our baby. I chose us. I chose life. I chose justice. And in the end, those choices saved not just Hope and me, but potentially countless other women who might have become his future victims. The choice was never really difficult. The only challenge was finding the courage to act on what I already knew was right.